2/3 instead of 50%. The next one, I don't think I need to go too far into that because everyone's familiar, but it's what's being referred to as the billionaire's tax. One thing to note about that specific to Prop 98 funding is that it is, unlike general revenue increases for the state, there would not be the normal Prop 98 set aside of 40%. 10% instead would be set aside for food assistance and or education-related programs. So schools would not be getting that 40% of the funding, the revenue that's generated from this measure. There's also the possibility of reducing the tax base for Prop 98 in the future as a result of this, although experts disagree. And then two more that I'll just quickly note that were backed by the Building Better California, which is from the Google co-founder that recently qualified for the November ballot. The first one would prohibit exempting special taxes from the GAN limit and requires pre-election and ongoing audits of new taxes. That's another way to potentially prevent new tax measures in the future. And then that second one that passed would prohibit new taxes on an individual's assets and holdings and prohibit some retroactive taxes. So that's those two measures are kind of were put forward to try to prevent essentially the billionaire selection going forward. There was a third measure back by that same group that didn't move forward, but that would have been specific to preventing any new tax measure from moving forward. That would essentially support Prop 98, so would have forced every new tax measure moving forward to align with Prop 98 and Prop 98 and give school districts that 40%. So if anyone has any questions for this section, happy to answer them. The plan after any questions is to actually move forward onto our revenue generating proposals now that this context has been provided, and then hopefully have a robust discussion.
Mark, I have a question. If I can go back to slide 18, you're talking specifically about examples of other state funding sources, right? These bullet points, I think it's kind of misleading because they are not fully funded, correct? For example, school meals. I don't know a single school district was able to provide for all of their food services with receipt of like $2 or $3 in reimbursement per meal per student, right? That's not covering the cost of the meal, let alone the labor that's being provided. So those aren't fully funded, correct?
No, here's an allocation.
Right,
this
exactly.
is what the state allocates funding for. They put money for school meals. We're not taking, of course, but I'm welcome on repeat that, but we at SAL level, we're not at this point, it's more for information. We're not arguing whether there's more of, less of, we will say there needs to be more of.
Exactly.
But it's just information that this is where the money goes from the state of California.
And then it's going to the special education at 8602, that doesn't cover the cost. And as you were saying in the later slide, when you're talking about the types of needs and services that, even as this particular school district is providing to, students with special needs, it doesn't cover it at all. So I would like to also see some focus when we're talking about these other funding sources that we're looking at is how to increase the funding for these sources, because quite frankly, you're looking at it thinking, oh great, they've got money for that, awesome, fantastic, they're getting money to feed students, they don't need more money. But they don't really show that the funding is nowhere near adequate for the programs that are being provided to students, not just here, but statewide.
Maybe what might be helpful, I would appreciate that. I think what might be helpful, just so that we also understand the additional context, is given that, what is it that Valley Unified currently has, and what is the balance of what is needed?
Exactly.
So that we understand the real picture of the need.
And I asked if this is an example of that, but I watched the last school board meeting where they were talking about the fiscal stabilization plan, and there were many people who came up to speak, including a second grader from my school, about how the after-school program was really important to her. And that was actually getting cut. They're in plan to get cut. So that, for instance, is that what you're talking about, right? There's a gap there that
huge.
like, so ELOP goes to my principal, and it's like, she's always figuring out like, oh, where can I use this? But it doesn't necessarily go to after-school care. And we are Title I school, so we really rely on funding that is not this.
Exactly, again.
Yeah, okay.
And any other comments or questions on this particular landscape, kind of all that we covered in the last 20 minutes?
I'd just like to share, there's an update to the budget that state preschool is now going to be part of Prop 98. And that is something that we need to take into consideration statewide.
Yes, and to that point, and just put a little more color, and Jennifer, you can also share more information. There is, historically, I mentioned before, with Prop 98, it was kindergarten through 12th grade, 14 community colleges. And then when the state of California passed permission of kindergarten for all 4-year-olds starting last year was the first was fully implemented. It also Prop 98 of course TK, the 4-year-olds in public schools. There were years ago, I think back in the 08 recession and budget years afterwards, that the legislature used to fund and in and out over the decades. Federal community-based provided preschool for families that is outside of the school setting. And I mentioned before that as we understand from state lawmakers, Prop 98 was meant to be for local educational agencies. But at this point, as Jennifer pointed out, the legislature was very interested to see community-based preschool slots be paid out of Prop 98. There's an overarching concern that that's going to be taken away from the prices, and so it's not growing, and if it's not growing, then you're going to see how the competing priorities for where the money goes. But anything else you want to add, Jennifer?
Just that it will take money out of Prop 98, right? So it's not, of course we want state-funded preschool. We need our babies to have a great, strong foundation, especially when they get to be in elementary school. It's very helpful. However, the funding source is an important part. So if it's coming out of Prop 98, that means less money for my 4th graders that I'm trying to serve. And we have to just always look at those funding sources and challenge them, because legislators sometimes don't understand that Prop 98, why we hold on to it, that it's protected money that taxpayers have put in place since 1988, and we don't let anybody touch it. You know, we have to defend it. So any additional costs need to come outside of that side of the budget. It's a little complicated because then it sounds like we don't like preschool, right? And that is not the case. So this is a hot issue right now in Sacramento, real time. And it did pass the two-party deal this week. So it's up to the governor to add it next week.
On this one, when we talk about the pie, so you said the pie stays the same, but it actually shrinks because you're putting in
It's
more.
the percentage. That stays
Right,
the same.
right.
The percentage stays the
But I
same.
think that
there's
we need
a
to
lot.
be clear that if we bring another program into Prop 98, the money gets diffused.
Right, right.
Although I think that's part of the point you're all making, and Jennifer also acknowledging that the true cost of a program or service is not sufficient to cover the cost, and the other comments you all have been making. This is where I mentioned at the beginning of my comments that there's a tension in Sacramento in helping to frame the need for more funding for public education, because they keep seeing an increase. This slide is not right, it's factual. And then there's the Department of Enrollment. There used to be a time when California had close to 6.5 million students. We're now at the state level close to 5.7 million students. For LAUSD, there used to be a time where LA Unified had over 700,000 students back in 2000. LA Unified now has 398,000 going lower every year. So the kind of the reconciliation has to happen is in the communication on framing or messaging and informing the elected officials and the public is if there's more money flowing to our school, because this is factual, this is true, but there's less students in public education, where's the money going? Why do you need more money? Because the reality is that per pupil amount through Prop 98 has gone up on a per pupil basis because there's less students to give the money to. You have more money but less students, and so the per pupil amount of those kids who are in public schools has gone up. As costs have gone up and everything else.
However, several years ago, Stanford did a study on the actual cost of quality education, and we are nowhere near, even with declining enrollment, even with increases, we're still not funding education at the level that it needs to be. I think that's part of the argument and the framing that we have to.
I agree that we need stronger analysis connecting revenue proposals to actual advocacy targets. What does it actually cost to be thinking these
There's
Starting in preschool.
Yeah, and there's national rankings, and so we have grown in California. We're now quite closer, we're above the national average, but we still need the public to understand we are not in the top 10 state countrywide and the fourth largest economy in the world. It's criminal, absolutely criminal.
Myra, could you please make the comment you made beforehand, or I want to make sure we capture it?
Yeah, just that we need a stronger analysis connecting revenue proposals. I know this is kind of, we haven't talked about the revenue proposals yet, but like connecting that to actual adequacy targets. To be able to answer the question, what does it actually cost to meet students' needs?
And I'm sorry, I'll just interject a little bit. It sounds like some people are having trouble hearing the conversation, so if everyone can just speak a little bit louder.
Thank you. So if we go on to the other section about initiatives, also the work of this group, kind of clarifying some of the boundaries of what the intent of this group might be in discussion moving forward at future meetings. Anything else before we pivot to the other part of the conversation and discussion on the initiative themselves? All right, so I'll turn it over to Geneva.
Okay, just a little bit of context. I'm going to go over some of the revenue proposals that we've distributed to you all through the primer we sent out. Then we're going to have a section for questions, and then hopefully we'll have enough time to have a really good discussion on some of them, with the understanding that it's just hopefully one discussion of many. This one might be a little bit more brief and surface level as I go through them, but the thought is that we'll have more in-depth discussions in the coming months and meetings, including with expert guest speakers who are the real researchers and experts on taxation policy. This list was sort of kind of putting not everything, but a lot of things on the board with the intention of narrowing it down based off of what would be most beneficial and or feasible. And it drew heavily from the Getting Down to Facts report that was recently published by state education researchers, as well as the Legislative Analyst's Office report on major and minor taxation options. So this is going to be broken down into two different buckets. One of them is education-specific policy ideas. Some of them will just be touching on education. Some of them will be increasing the pie, as we've talked about. Others will just be restructuring the pie, somewhat to make it more equitable and more beneficial to our students. The other part would be, the biggest part is statewide taxation policy ideas. As we all know, due to Prop 98, we get 40% of any funding that goes into the general fund. So any statewide taxation policy ideas that we're discussing, it would automatically benefit us because we get 40% chunk of it. And the benefit of that is also we might have even more people and organizations to collaborate with outside of education who would also benefit from an increase in general funds. Another important note, this is also will be separated out by path of enactment, because as a school district there are very important limitations on what we can say and do. So for legislation, we can advocate, as you all are very familiar with. We can do letters, lobbying, meetings with legislature. However, for ballot initiatives, we are not allowed to advocate. We can't take a position. We can't do lobbying on it. We can only inform on what the ballot initiatives are, what the potential ballot initiatives are, what their impacts could be. So important for our discussion later on. Okay, so for education-specific policy ideas, the first is LCFF reform. Because of that declining enrollment, obviously it has very many drawbacks and negative side effects, but a potential benefit of it that can come is that researchers estimate there will be $7.5 billion in excess Prop 98 funds by 2030 due to that declining enrollment. So there are options for how we could use those extra funds, in particular to make it more equitable for our students. So one thing that has been discussed a lot is a regional cost of living adjustment. As we all know, it's very expensive to live in Los Angeles. So is it fair that we get the same amount as a school district where housing prices are a lot lower, service prices are a lot lower? Some arguments that have been made against that is, it would be equitable in some ways, but it would also come with automatic people against it, legislators who, live in those lower cost areas, and we know that this would not benefit them. There are also some equity concerns potentially from some that, we would benefit, and our higher ed students would, but so would Orange County and Silicon Valley and Malibu, whereas the Central Valley wouldn't. So there's back and forth on that. Other potential options for using that LCFF reform or excess dollars could be to increase the equity multiplier or supplemental grant for unduplicated students, so that it's very targeted towards higher need students. Another thing that's been discussed is maybe changing the definition of low income, because right now it's based off of who qualifies for fair or reduced lunch. So maybe we could change it to something that would capture more lower income students. So there are a lot of ideas on the board, and that would be to restructure the pie so that it's more equitable and that LAUSD would receive more funds. Another restructure in the pie would be enrollment-based funding. As you are all very familiar, California schools are all currently funded according to student attendance, whereas 45 other states are funded based off of student enrollment. So switching to enrollment-based system could mean more funding for Los Angeles Unified, and the largest increases would go to districts with higher need pupils, who, sometimes for reasons outside of our control and theirs, sometimes have lower attendance despite our best efforts. One thing to note there is that our current attendance-based system is based off of a rolling 3-year average to some kind of soften out any changes or major fluctuations in attendance year to year. That's maybe something to consider for any switch to an enrollment-based system, to soften any major fluctuations for enrollment as enrollment continues to decrease at many school districts. Parcel tax threshold, we've talked a little bit about that already. Right now in California, parcel taxes must be passed by 2/3 of voters unless they are citizen initiated, which as of right now can pass with just 50% of the votes. So there's a few ways in which that can pass. It could be initiated by the government, 2/3 vote. It could be citizen initiated, 50% vote. Another potential option would be changing the state constitution. So the state legislature could put forward a constitutional amendment to lower the passage thresholds, specifically for personal taxes. Something that's been thrown around is lowering it to 55%, so that it aligns with the school bonds carve-outs. That way, it would make it easier for school districts to win passage of this revenue source. Another one is equalization formulas. This has been contemplated by the Getting Down Facts reports. It would be to address the funding disparity caused by local property tax revenue surpassing LCFF entitlements in basic aid school districts. So some have suggested perhaps we can employ an equalization formula that recaptures property tax revenue from school districts that receive local property taxes in excess of their LCFF entitlements and redistribute it to schools with less property wealth. As we can all imagine, that would probably get some pretty fierce pushback from some very resourced communities and potentially legal challenges as well. A sort of another proposal in the legislature right now that kind of gets at this as well is SB 5 by Senator Cortese, which would create essentially a Prop 98 endowment so that the Prop 98 fund can benefit from investments in that endowment. There's question of whether that would be able to get through the legislature this cycle, considering that endowment would be created from both Prop 98 funds and general funds, and right now the general funds and
said there was you said there was, what's the build number on the Cortese?
Um,
I'm sorry, I'll speak. That was the build number on the Cortese.
SCA 5.
Senate Constitutional Amendment, so SCA. But the deadline to put anything on that was yesterday. So
Yes, I didn't make
it
it.
didn't
Yeah,
make it.
Yeah.
so it's something that could come up again in a different form perhaps, maybe as we get to the LCFF reform, excess funds, there could be a potential, to explore maybe creating an endowment for Prop 98 specifically through Prop 98 funds. It would, be a longer term investment, so it would take some time to see the payoff. So,
Yeah.
but that's one thing that might pop up more for consideration.
If I can just add for clarification, that last idea that Geneva has wanted to, getting down to fact studies, it's a collaborative of researchers from Stanford, Berkeley, UCLA, USC, and UC Davis, I believe, the 5 universities. They released in May the third 3.0 version of research policy briefs on different topics, and the first one was back in 2008 or 9. So there's been an evolution of different research about schools and funding and whatnot. So the Senate Constitutional Amendment by Cortese, Senator Cortese from the Bay Area, SCA 5, any of this would be, I would say, for consideration discussion with the next governor next year. None of this, I don't think, was given.
Yeah.
So it's more just like the landscape. And we had in the earlier slide about one of the potential discussion points for the task force and with the new chair, Salazar, and helping to inform discussions moving forward. Is there any interest from this task force to put together, especially on the restructuring the pie, or anything that the legislature could do, not to the ballot initiative for the reasons that Geneva already outlined, but more to the legislative process that could increase revenues, that could direct money for public education. That would be consideration for anything to provide to the next governor prior to them taking that office in January of 2027. So this is more just like landscape awareness of what's being discussed in Sacramento at this time.
Yeah, this is kind of what's being discussed, what different researchers have brought forward, and it's initiating the conversation of what we might, what's something you might want to support, and just giving context to what these discussions are. Okay, so I will move on to statewide taxation policy ideas. Again, this will be broken down by path to enactment. And so all of these, because of Prop 13's restrictions on property tax, it could not be passed by the legislature. It would have to be passed through the ballots. So one is split roll property tax. This option, as we've discussed, as has been discussed, would be to reform Prop 13 to tax commercial property on its market value instead of its assessed value. So it would be a carve out for Prop 13 specifically for commercial value, usually high value commercial properties. This was attempted a few years back and was 2% of the voters opposed, but it was pretty close. Another option is alternatively a statewide commercial property tax rate. That's been discussed as well. It would be less equitable than the option above. Another one that's been more in the conversation very recently is a get-a-terra tax. That's a tax on vacant luxury second homes that are not being used. One of those taxes was recently passed in New York City, so that's something that can be contemplated either on a local or statewide level. These are ideas that could be passed through legislation or ballot measure. It's not property specific, so it could be passed through legislation. However, because it's a new tax, if it passed the legislation, it would have to pass by a 2/3 vote. Alternatively, it could pass by a majority vote by voting as a ballot measure. So it could be some options are increasing the income tax more for millionaires. Another option is putting forward a estate tax or inheritance tax because those were both repealed in California. That's something, and 16 other states have at least either an inheritance tax or an estate tax. An alternative, perhaps, to estate taxes is that California can eliminate the income tax exemption for inheritance inherited assets. That exemption was created when estate taxes were still in existence in California to avoid double taxation. But now, there have been arguments made that perhaps not quite as relevant because at this moment in time, stepped-up basis creates a situation where assets are appreciating in value, but the capital gain of those assets may never be realized because appreciation under the prior owner is never calculated into the equation. A sold inherited asset is calculated by comparing the sale price of the asset to its value when they received it, not the original purchase price. Okay, and I understand I'm going through it a little quickly so we can get to the discussion, but this is also reflecting what is in our primer. We'll definitely have more discussions in the future. So a few more options. We could do a graduated corporate income tax. That means more profitable companies are paying a greater share of taxes. Another option that's been discussed is revenue recapture for personal income tax. This would require high-income earners to pay the highest tax rate on all of their income above the tax bracket in which their income falls. This system is used by New York and Connecticut. And then another thing that's been proposed is extending our sales tax from solely, physical or media items that we buy, but to also services. Now that, as a state and country, we are moving more towards a service-based economy. There are a few options how to do that here. One thing to note is that this revenue source would likely be more stable year to year compared to personal income tax. However, it's also more aggressive and less equitable because it's more likely to fall on more ordinary people and not just a very high income people or high income corporations. Okay, so a few options that could be passed through legislation. One is the Water's Edge tax loophole. I won't go too far into this because this is the AB 1790 measure that's currently in the legislation now. And we've already discussed a little bit, but essentially this loophole allows multinational corporations with significant offshore profits to shift their profits to foreign jurisdictions with low tax rates and therefore avoid our higher California tax rates. There's tax credit accountability. That's the idea of evaluating every tax credit as a spending program and saying if we're spending $3.5 billion on this, is that more effective use of our funds as putting it into healthcare or education or any other issue. So there are a few ways to do that, including doing more periodic reviews of the benefits of those tax expenditures. There's also limiting the R&D tax, which is mainly used by a relatively small number of large corporations. The governor and legislature's current budget proposal to cap tax credits kind of gets at that. There's limitations potentially on net operating loss deductions for companies, as well as replacing some tax deductions with a tax credit instead. So it would be replacing those tax deductions with a smaller credit. So it would be a smaller tax benefit to people, but it would be available to all taxpayers, not just those who itemize